Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for being here. My name is Luis Guzman. I'm professor here in the School of Engineering in the Universidad de los Andes. I was just here to say welcome again to be here, or Congress. And we are ready to begin our conference in this moment. So I want to introduce our Dean of Engineer, Ruby Casallas. She is gonna be here for a while to welcome to our audience. Thank you, Ruby, for being here, and welcome.
Welcome to the 2024 World Symposium on Transport and Land Use Research. It is a pleasure to have you all here in Bogotá at the Universidad de los Andes School of Engineering. This is the first time the event is being held in Latin America and the Global South, making it a particularly special occasion for us. We are delighted to welcome our 130 participants from various countries, including South and North America, Europe, China, India, and some African nations. Bogotá, as you all know, and maybe already you have seen, is a very large city that vividly encapsulates the challenges and opportunities that your community of researchers strives to address. Its rapid growth has led to urban expansion, increased traffic congestion, inequitable access to transportation, and significant environmental impacts, to mention some of the issues. As the Dean of the School of Engineering, I have to say that I feel very proud of the work done so far by the Urban and Regional Sustainability Studies Group here at the UniAndes. The research in the group has been at the forefront of tackling these complex city issues through advanced studies, innovative, and interdisciplinary projects. Just to mention a few, they work on the Transmillennium bus system through sustainable mobility plans. Their research on the Metro cable system highlights how cable cars can offer sustainable and efficient transportation solutions in highly urban areas, while also transforming the lives of nearby residents. Their study on the city's extensive cyclovia network emphasized the importance of promoting cycling as a viable and green mode of transport. By 2027, we hope, Bogotá will have its first metro line. A couple of weeks ago, we had the kickoff of the Bogotá City Lab initiative. This initiative was conceived by UniAndes, Pro Bogotá, which includes some private companies, and the local government of the city. This city lab aims at providing data analytics to support better urban planning decisions. The name of one of the first projects currently running is Bogotá is getting ready for the metro. Among other things, this project is exploring the impact of transportation infrastructure and land use patterns. All those projects have provided invaluable insights into creating more efficient, equitable, and sustainable urban environments, and more importantly, they have produced concrete changes in the city. Thank you to the World Society for Transport and Land Use Research for allowing us to host this symposium at UniAndes. I would like to acknowledge Professor Luis Ángel Guzmán for his leadership in organizing this event, and extend my gratitude to every member of his team for making it possible. Welcome once again, Let's work together to create more sustainable, efficient, and livable cities for all. Have a wonderful week.
Thank you very much for Dean. And right now we have for Head of Civil and Environment Engineer Department, Professor Juan Pablo Bucarejo, to say some words.
Good morning to everyone. Good morning, Luis Ángel, our Dean, Ruby Casallas. Thank you very much for presenting and opening this very important international seminar. We are very happy to have you here today, and we are looking forward for a very exciting week of exchanging experiences, research, ideas around a very important topic for our cities, for our territories. Land use and transportation is something that used to be planned and studied separately, and I think this new way of seeing the future, looking at the two main aspects related strongly, has done a lot of good to our cities. I think this is a very relevant topic. We will see how Bogotá is a good example on what's been happening planning land use and transportation. So we have very interesting case studies. For example, the BRT, Transmilenio, that has been running for more than 20 years. We have been studying the impacts of the BRT in land use, the development of the businesses around housing, around creating value, trying to capture this value. So this is a very interesting topic. There are other topics that have been studied in the city. For example, and also in Medellin, we have here our keynote speaker, Julio, who has worked with us in a very interesting project in Medellin a while ago. And so we studied how these mass transit projects have an impact on people, on the social development, but also on the urban development. And so we've been having very interesting research in Universidad de los Andes, in Grupo Sur, around the impact of Transmicable, a cable car that has been implanted in the south of the city, one of the low-income part of the cities, with a lot of social difficulties, social challenges. So this is also very interesting. As our Dean was mentioning, we have new challenges that deserve to be studied. For example, the development of the first metro line and the planning of the second and contracting of the second metro line. So I think this is a good opportunity for researchers to see what the impacts could be and to have a good material to study these new impacts created by the metro. We need to have a strong baseline. So we need to work today to have a strong baseline so we can find interesting results of our research. There is also something very interesting in Bogotá, and is the suburban expansion of the city. So this is an invitation also to look at this new element that is been taking place at the moment. And the good news is, I think that Bogota has a lot of data. Our governments, local and regional governments, are open to provide this data. We have good data related to transportation in the late years. And so I think Bogota case is very, and Colombian case, cities, Colombian cities, are probably very interesting for you, international researchers and local researchers, to start looking at impacts and new things. And finally, I would like to also mention the importance of looking and doing this research around the social impacts, around people, around gender, around low income and inequalities. So I'm sure you will have a wonderful week. Bogota is very fun. I don't know, some of the ones who the first time they come, I think you enjoy, and we are very proud to have you here to host this seminar, and we are really very excited to be able to exchange ideas this week with this important crew of researchers worldwide. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juan Pablo. Thank you, Juan Pablo, for these words. And right now, just before our first keynote to speak, we have here to Joao. Joao Abreu is our, please come here. Joao is our chair of the organization of our symposium. Joao, welcome.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you, Luis Angel. Good morning, everyone. First of all, welcome to Bogota. I would like to thank our kind hosts, the University of the Andes, and our local committee, presided by Luis Angel Guzman. And so we have a very interesting program with 3 very interesting keynotes and several workshops that I hope that you all enjoy. And so let's start with the technical part of this conference.
Thank you very much, Joao. And right now, finally, we have our first keynote speaker, Professor Julio Davila from Bartlett Development Union, UCL. Julio, thank you very much for being here and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Luis. Sí, oye, ¿puedo señalar? ¿Con qué? ¿Con este lado? Morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be here in my alma mater. I'm a civil engineer from the University of los Andes many decades ago, many more than I care to remember. Thank you very much to Luis, to Jonas, the boss who invited me. I feel very privileged to be here. I trained as a civil engineer, but also as a planner, an urban planner and urban economist. So in a way, I've done several rounds of looking at the city. And of course, Bogota, where I was born and spent my formative years, has been an enormous inspiration. And the work of my colleagues who've done real work with transport, like Juan Pablo, who mentioned work that we've done together, but as planners or secretaries of mobility, has been a huge inspiration. And Colombia in general, the process of decentralization. Bearing in mind that this is an international congress, I've taken to heed what Luis asked us to do, which is to speak about Latin America. So if you forgive me, I'm going to give you a little bit of a historical overview of Latin America. So Latin Americans may start nodding off and yawning, but this is actually designed for people like my colleague Steve Marshall, who is here, and Jonas, who don't really know Latin America, to give you a little bit of historical background, a very personal view of it, and of course debatable, like all academic ideas. I want to start with this quote, and some of you, since the Euros are on, and we had the final of the Colombian League 2 nights ago, then I thought I'd quote with, I would start with a quote from Diego Maradona, who's no longer with us. And it reads much better in Spanish. It looks awful in English. Yo crecí en un barrio privado de Buenos Aires, so a private neighborhood, privado de agua, luz y teléfono. And that encapsulates, so it's really privado in Spanish means deprived. So it doesn't work really in English, but this encapsulates the reality of millions of people in this continent. So what I want to do is take you a little bit through the reality of this, which is the most highly urbanized continent in the world, with differences. Look at the historical roots of spatial segregation, which, as I said, is debatable. I'm happy to have a debate with anybody. I'm not a historian, but I love reading historians of a city. Then I would argue that modernist planning, which has been big, which came as an input from Europe, has been important in many cities in Latin America. I was reading that not so much in Mexico City, but certainly in Bogotá, in Medellín, Buenos Aires, Santiago. Then take a few looks at the issues that concern us here, land use and transport in Latin America today. Now, this is an enormous subject, and I think, thankfully, you guys who are going to be presenting papers in the next 3 days are going to fill in a lot of these gaps. And looking at the titles, I'm really excited because it's such a huge topic, because we're dealing with some of the biggest challenges in the world today. So I'm just going to give you headlines, but you fill the gaps in your papers, in your discussions. My argument, and I think Juan Pablo mentioned it, and the Dean as well, urban transport reinforces inequalities. And that's a reality in Latin American cities, and that's a reality in many places, unless we do something about it. So the more I work on urban transport, which I've been working on only in the last 10 to 15 years, the more I realize that it is one of the most important areas in which we can influence a reduction in inequalities and an improvement in well-being of people. Then I'll move on to some generalities about urban form, active travel and health. I also work a lot with colleagues who come from the public health area, including colleagues here in Los Andes like Olga Sarmiento, and we've got a project that my colleague Daniel Oviedo and others will present at some point, these days. But it is important that we look also at health, because the health largely is urban now. As the world has urbanized, and we're more than 50% of the population is urban, we have to start thinking of health as being an urban issue. And we who work in the built environment, either as transport planners, urban planners, architects, designers, etc., have a lot to contribute. So health cannot be only in the hands of public health people, epidemiologists, and clinicians. And then I look forward, as several people who spoke before me have said, to positive things. Let's end with the good news. Not necessarily, I don't believe in best practices, but I think there are ways of looking at problems which are inspirational. Now, as I said, Latin America is the world's most urbanized region in the world with, estimates vary and depends on how you define urban and so on, what the cutoff point is. But it's 80%, 81%, with Uruguay being the most urbanized. It's a small country, but then Argentina is a big country with 92% of urbanization. Followed by Venezuela. Colombia is in about 80%. And the smallest countries in Central America, like Guatemala and Honduras, are the lowest, least urbanized. That's still higher than in most of sub-Saharan Africa, which is a continent that I work on quite a lot, as well a little bit with India, but I wouldn't claim to be an expert in these areas. But this is to say Latin America is essentially an urbanized country, and that has historical roots, as I would show you. 5 metropolitan areas have population of over 10 million, so they're mega cities technically. But we also have in Latin America some of the highest interpersonal wealth inequalities as measured by the Gini coefficient. I've just a few examples there with Brazil and Colombia among the top, Chile as well, and so on. But these are by far the highest. So this all has historical roots. Not a lot we can do about that. Now, the roots of this urbanization levels, and I was talking to a colleague who's a historian, and the more I think about it, why is Latin America so urbanized? And largely is the fact that the colonization that came from Europe in the 1500s, from the Spaniards and also the Portuguese, as part of that expansion, imperial expansion, which was very early and much earlier than say, France and Britain, was built around cities. They were building on two things, mainly. They were building on the Roman Empire way of occupying through the castrum, so setting up, sort of essentially barracks in different places to occupy the territory and control it, so they had learned from that. But also, they were reacting in many ways against the Islamic expansion that swept over North Africa and the whole of the Iberian Peninsula, even getting at 2 points of France, from the 10th to about the 13th or 14th century, which of course the Spaniards, being sort of staunch Christians, fought for many generations and many decades and centuries until the Islamic dwellers, which were largely Arab speakers, were driven out in 1492, which is a time when Columbus arrived in Latin America. So it's not a coincidence that there was a simultaneous process. Now the Spaniards were staunch Christians because they had been fighting the Islamic peoples for generations and centuries. And for them, Christianity was a way of actually showing, sort of colonizing and organizing territory. So there was a physical, special expression of Christianity here. And effectively, they saw natives which were, occupied areas like Peru and, of course, Mexico, which were the two largest concentration of population, as inferior, even though they were vastly advanced, in many ways, many more advanced civilizations that where they came from. Spain was largely medieval place, very unequal, very poor, and a lot of people who came here were very, very poor as well. But that occupation of territory was always centered on cities or foundations, which we could call now today cities or principles of cities, initials. So they were given European city names. Sometimes they kept the names, particularly in Mexico, of local populations. And in a way, urban planning or urban design reflected these values. So you can see this in, for example, the plan of Buenos Aires, 1583. So little less than a century before, after the Europeans first arrived in the continent. And you can see they're using a very geometric plan, essentially a sort of chessboard plan. And everyone, you can't read it there, but every one of these plots of land has the name of one person, one individual to whom the land had been assigned. And in the center of it, you find the symbols of power. The church, very big one. The Cabildo, which was the mayor's office or the city's organization, and sometimes the army barracks. You can still see it. If you go to Plaza de Bolívar, a few blocks from here in Bogotá, you'll see the cathedral on one side. You can see the Congress building, Parliament building, another one. You can see the city's office behind, and you can see the courts. So the plaza and this plan in chessboard plan became the form of occupation, again taken from a castrum, the Roman Empire occupations. Catlahualca, which is a small town in Mexico, has the same thing with the church being prominent, and Havana, again, 16th century plan. It's difficult to find plans, and this is I found in a book by my dear friend and former boss, Jorge Enrique Ardo, a wonderful urban historian with whom I worked for several years, he died in 1993. And then you can see the same thing in Havana, and you can actually see something which is difficult to see here. Right here, there's a chain. This is the Bay of Havana, and there's a chain that extends from one side to the other, because this was it is a wonderful bay, and that's the way to keep out the pirates, particularly the British pirates, or privateers. Now, these as I was saying, urban origins of colonialism partially explains these high levels of urbanization. And it's much higher than in sub-Saharan Africa and much of Asia. And this is part of the roots of it. So most Latin American capital cities were founded in the 1500s. And by 1940s, this is a wonderful book by Francis Violich, which I have from 1944, where it shows, he was one of the first people to write about Latin American cities and planning. He's got several books. Now, let's move on to a little bit of theory, which is what concerns us here in this symposium. One of the earliest models to try and explain how cities operate, and this link between land prices, movements of people, movements of goods, is von Thünen, writing in Germany. I don't think he was a geographer. I'm not sure what his profession was. Maybe he was one of these Renaissance people. But in the 1820s, his model, which was very simplified, of course, was based on German, what he observed in Germany, is that of a flat land with agricultural produce around, with an urban settlement, which in Germany was one of the most urbanized places in the world at the time, which was very small compared to today. You've got a market where people go and sell the goods. You've got around it, you've got the crops, you've got forests and intensive farming and so on. You can see it very clearly. The issue for him was land prices increase the closer you are to the market, the higher the land prices are going to be. So it's one of the earliest models we have to explain that relationship. William Alonso in the 1960s, looking largely at US cities, extended that idea or adapted it to modern contemporary cities, which have to do with commuters. Of course, these were large cities, sprawling, like LA, this picture here, which I grabbed from the internet in the 1960s. So essentially we're saying, similar thing, the closer you are to locations of opportunities, jobs, universities, health services, etc., the higher land prices are going to be. So these are models that have helped explain a phenomenon which is largely a 20th century one. There's a classic book by Mitchell and Rapkin. I was talking to one of my former professors who studied engineering and planning in the US in the 1960s, and he said that was the book to learn about transport. But of course, to be fair, they talk about urban traffic. They don't talk about transport, which is a broader concept. And for them, it was about how do you design highways in a way that make the connectivity in cities or within cities and also between cities more effective. That's a classic, but it resonates a lot with what we did. This was the standard textbook for at least a generation, particularly in the US. Now, when you look at it, you realize, gosh, this is not how we can interpret Latin America today. Things are much more complex today, not only because our understanding of realities is more complex. We're much more multidisciplinary. So we can see, as Juan Pablo was saying, the social dimensions of these processes, but we can also see the environmental dimensions. And in cities like Latin America, they're much more heterogeneous, and this is what I'm attempting to show here. And I'm just going to give you the headlines and try and touch upon them, but again, you guys are going to fill in a lot of these gaps in your own research. Urban form is an important one, I'll show you why. Topography and density are very important. Vehicle ownership patterns have been changing enormously. Latin America is a case in point. Socioeconomic factors, and I'll talk about inequalities there. Land ownership structures have been enormously influential in Latin America. And in a city like Bogotá, which is one of the densest cities in the world, the land around Bogotá is very, very valuable for agricultural purposes, largely cattle and horticulture. and is largely owned by very large, very powerful landowners, or has been historically. Of course, then, as the state progresses, regulation and incentives become important as well. Trade policies, opening up or liberalizing the economy is important and affects cities in different ways. Investment infrastructure, sustainability, labor and land informality are very important in Latin America, and as they are in many cities around the world, particularly sub-Saharan Africa and a lot of Asia. So let's look at land density. So this is a fabulous graph, which is now a little old, is from UN Habitat Classic, which I still use because I think it's a brilliant source of teaching and learning. This I don't know if people can see at the back, but this is 1780, this is 2005, and you've got density per square kilometer. And this is in persons. You've got Algiers, Manila, Mumbai here in about 1855, Paris, London. Of course, data were very scarce, but what this shows is the cities in the so-called developing countries or global south start out as being very, very dense. Largely the settlement patterns that I showed for Latin America, which were very, very dense areas, and of course, transport technology wasn't there to move long distances. But they were all huddled around, if you've been to Jakarta, you realize that the original Dutch settlement was very, very central and very, very compact. And Jakarta couldn't be more expanded now. So you start out as being very, very low density, very high density, and then suddenly, and this is Paris, London, Sydney. Now, a lot of these earlier settlements in the so-called developing world converge all in one point of very, very low density compared to what it was historically. And the reasons are complex, but have to do with technology, and I'll go through them a little bit. But cities that started out very low density, like LA, Johannesburg, Sydney, even London, they just stay roughly at the same level. So it's a brilliant way of showing that density has an importance in how we move around. This is another one which is quite standard, and it shows that the higher the density, the more the higher the density, like Hong Kong, which is a fabulous example, at least when this was produced, which was in the early 2000s. The consumption of energy per capita, and this is largely looking at fossil fuels as opposed to electric vehicles. We have to rethink this in terms of electric vehicles, is very different to what, say, cities with very low density, like the American cities, built around the highway, again, Mitchell and Rapkin's ideas, it's very different. Now, the other thing is, another concept within this, another concept, I don't know what I'm doing this. Sorry. I'm pressing the wrong button, I think. Now, Latin American colonial cities started out as being monocentric, largely. So all built around the plaza, everything was there within walking distance. And eventually they become more and more polycentric. Now, the issue is a lot of the key functions are still in a central area. So you'll see in Bogotá, most of the universities, except particularly the private universities, are around this neighborhood. All around you, if you go south, it's all private universities, including this one. There's one national university, which is in a planned campus in the 1930s. Now, I move on to now thinking about modernist planning, and my contention is that modernist planning has had an influence in the way that Latin American cities have evolved. Modernist planning is associated with people like Le Corbusier, who's a Swiss architect, who moved to France and had this crazy plan for Paris, which was to essentially raise to the ground Paris and make it into sort of tall buildings, which in 1928, I think it was. Thankfully, it never got built. But they advocated through a thing called the Charte d'Athènes, the Athens Charter, which I have the version in Spanish of, looking at the city in a very rationalistic way. A lot of these people were inspired by, if you like, socialist equity principles. So they wanted a city, the old city was a city of inequality, the old city was a city that was encumbered with a lot of complexities. We want a fresh start, let's start anew. And Brasilia, in Brazil, the capital of Brazil, which was built in the 50s and 60s, is an example of that. So if you think of Brasilia, this is modernist planning at its best or at its worst, depending. Chandigarh in India as well is another example, which is again designed by Le Corbusier. Brasilia was designed by a follower of Le Corbusier. And they looked at essentially 4 functions: dwelling, work, leisure, and transport infrastructure. just to cut a long story short, as Diane Davis says in a brilliant review of modernism she's a sociologist, she takes a particular view, she argues that modernist planning and modernist ideas led to increased urban violence. It's a complex argument, I'm not sure I get it completely, but I hugely respect Diane's work. But essentially what she says, I'm going to read this. With industrial progress the intended aim, modernist plans prioritize the needs of industry and its workers in redesigning the urban fabric, while also privileging the role of transport to ensure the efficient mobility of goods and people. Now, this is a nugget. This has had a lot of information. What she brings into this is several ideas. One is modernist planning wanted a city which was designed for the manufacturing era, for the industrial era, which is what had actually created so much wealth and so much growth in Europe and the US. Of course, since starting with the Industrial Revolution in the UK. But if you have that as an aim, and thinking that producing goods or manufacturing will actually lead to a better, richer society, but also a more just society, then you need to do a number of changes to make this possible. And that means changing the spatial conformation of a city. Now, that has implications because it means if people are in the wrong place, where there should be, for example, dwellings, or where there should be workplaces, they have to get out. And this led, in her views, which I think is it's a very interesting interpretation of it, to evictions, mass evictions of people who were in the wrong place, either in the central areas or in areas that were due for expansion. And that gave also an impetus to transport infrastructure. Now, in rich countries, this could, in theory, be realized because there was the money, there were the resources, the human resources, the institutional and regulatory tools to do it, but not in Latin America. So these plans always, in her argument and other people's arguments, were unfinished. And what we ended up with was partially finished plans, which essentially led to the worst of both worlds. High transport infrastructure, very intense, but at the same time, workers who were not in the central areas, they were evicted to the periphery. Now, this is one interpretation, there's other interpretations. Effectively, what I would argue is that a mixture of land speculation, of course, land was becoming expensive, von Thunen and Alonso, remember, technology, the new cars, planning, which was not always in the service of the poor, it was usually in the service of the landowners and the rich, contributed to separating these urban activities and a relative concentration of key functions and jobs in central areas. But people couldn't afford to be in central areas, so they had to move out. And eventually, the poor were relegated to informal settlements, in other words, precarious, not conforming to plans, poorly built, poorly designed, without basic services, etc., in informal peripheral areas, which is what you see in most of Latin America. And those of you who are going to go to Ciudad Bolívar on the technical visit, and we'll hear more from Luis and the organizers, that's an example of that. It's a largely unplanned area, vast area where about 1 million people live. Now, globalization, which meant essentially opening up economies, urban middle classes rising, being able to afford cars, motorized transport became cheaper, fuel became always subsidized. You know, fossil fuels have always been subsidized, let's face it, it's a reality. They don't pay the price, we don't pay the price for using but burning fossil fuel that the planet needs. This led to middle and high income households becoming more spatially dispersed to areas which were more desirable, including in gated communities. And planners then said, okay, well, people are moving out. We can't do much about it. This is what the market wants. Let's build more road infrastructure, right? This is a slightly simplified picture of it, but one that I think holds by and large. But let's build them with higher average speeds. So the motorization became central in the whole story. In a place like Bogotá, which doesn't have commuter rail, unlike several cities, Buenos Aires does, and then speed increases translate into longer travel distances rather than shorter travel times. And this is the great paradox, and I'll show you an example of that. The results were urban sprawl and technological lock-in. We locked in technologically into the car, whether it's a fossil fuel car or whether it's the the chimera, the dream, which I think is a silly dream, of the electric vehicle. I think we're locked into this and to the urban sprawl. And this is a big challenge for many reasons: social, environmental, and you name it. And this work by Cruz Munoz shows something very, very interesting, which is how the land we consume per capita in different cities has been growing, particularly in Buenos Aires and Rio de Janeiro, but enormously, in an enormous rate. Cities like Mexico and Sao Paulo remain relatively compact in relation to the population. So this high consumption per capita of land is a source of worry. This is a brilliant, and it's a very bad set of images in the sense that they're very pixelated, so you can't read. But essentially what it tells is the story of people who, at what time they have to get up. So the darker it is, the larger the proportion of population have to get up at a certain time. It's this Mexico City, which has a population of about 20 million, 19 million. And it shows what time people have to get up in these areas. The more peripheral they are, the earlier they have to get up. Then at 5 a.m., not get up, have to leave home to get to the work. And then, they start getting closer, because this is where the center of activities are. Of course, by 8 a.m., the pictures are a little more complex. But then in this, using the same data from, this is a 2017 origin destination survey by INEGI, I calculated this very simply, which is, of course, people who study have shorter commuting time, so up to 30 minutes, the vast majority, because schools are local, or they live locally if it's education, higher education institutions. But if it's work, the picture is more complex. So vast majority of people have to travel at least 60 minutes. Now, our colleagues here in Bogotá, Luis, Daniel, and others who are in this space, have done fabulous work about that, and as Juan Pablo was saying, there's a lot of data on Bogotá. So Bogotá is a very good case study. Essentially what it shows, we're about, Juan Pablo, and are we about here? Where are we? Around there, we're right here. Now Bogotá, as I think Juan Pablo says, is a very large city. The airport is around here, and all this area is essentially lower income levels. So down south, down that way. And that's Ciudad Bolívar is around here, right? And these areas are the richer areas, which is the north, is the sort of more tree-lined streets, where the shopping centers are and so on. And the city has expanded. North is expanding very, very rapidly, as Juan Pablo said, north, and especially, sorry, the airport is here, and west. Now, if you look at the commuting times, it's the inverse equation. So you have, people in the more central areas where the jobs are have a shorter commuting time. People in the peripheral areas have a much longer commuting time. And Valentina Montoya, who's here, has done fabulous work. She's going to present, tomorrow, about domestic workers in Bogotá, which actually fills in the gap and puts in names and faces to it. So it's very interesting work done. As Juan Pablo said, we've done work in Medellin. I've been working in Medellin, not recently, but for a long time. When I first went and saw the newly opened cable car, which was the first in the world to be used as a daily commuting vehicle, because it's usually associated, cable cars, telefericos, whatever you want to call them, are usually associated with tourism. Now, this was the first time it had been used, except the Roosevelt Island one in New York, for daily commuting. And more interestingly, it wasn't for any daily commuters, it was for the poor. And this is what caught my attention, and I mulling over that, helped with my colleagues who are here, put together this proposal. We got funding for it, and it was fabulous eye-opener, because that's when I realized that very strong linkages between transport and socioeconomic realities. And for those of you who haven't been to the Andes before, this is what the Andes look like, or one bit of the Andes. This is a very rich, beautiful valley of Medellin, the second largest city in Colombia with about 3.8 million people. This is only one bit of it, the central richest area, but also an area that has very poor neighborhoods. So you can see, this is, you can see these are the rich areas. This is the valley of the river Medellin. This is roughly the central area. This is the richest area, called it Poblado and other neighborhoods. These are sort of middle income areas, and these are low income areas. And you can see topography and densities play a role in all this. We did this study with, again, colleagues from Los Andes here and Medellin, and which was essentially the question that we were asked. This was a consultancy for the World Bank. Can the formal sector mechanisms compete with the informal sectors in supplying land and housing? That was the question we were asked. The answer was no. To cut a long story short, but in doing that, we did this mapping of what were the historical areas, the origins of different areas, or historical origins rather, of different areas in Medellin. This is only the municipality of Medellin, which is roughly what you saw in the pictures. And the more yellow areas, the darker and lighter yellow areas, have informal origins. In other words, they were not in the city plan. They were built by people themselves on what you could call spontaneous efforts, using precarious materials in high, steep areas with no basic services. This is what we call informality, for those of you who are not familiar with the term. And they've been regularized and legalized eventually, but we're looking at the origins. Everything else is either designed by the state or largely built by private sector developers. Now, this is across this picture I took, and without realizing that what I was telling, this picture tells the story of housing in Medellin over 30 or 40 years when I took it, which was about 10 years ago. And what you have is, it's all largely low income. These are recent land invasions. This is the informal, precarious occupation of land. They're not meant to be there because it's subject to landslides and so on. And you can see people have not invested in their housing because they could be evicted at any time. So if you're going to invest money in the way these people did, you're going to lose your money, or serious money. Whereas here, these people started out life as being informal, but they've managed to build 3 stories, of which my guess is 2 of these stories are actually rented out. So this is their pension, right? And there you can see, this is the kind of neighborhoods that the cable car tried to reach, not these particular ones, because it's in a slightly different part of town, but they're a mixture between these and these, right? And this is the only sort of formal sector housing you can see in this picture. So it tells you, the complexity of the story of Latin American cities, and Medellin is not too different from others. Now, I said that one of the messages here is that urban transport, in fact, reinforces inequalities. And the work that Hernandez and De Los Santos and Valentina Montoya, who's here with colleagues, have done, shows that there is a gender difference. And I think Lake probably will explore these issues on Wednesday morning. I think, no, maybe not? Yes. So I'm not going to spend too much because she is the real expert. But essentially what these colleagues find is that women depend much more than men on public transport. In Uruguay, women's trips tend to be more heterogeneous than simply, from A to B and B to A. They tend to travel shorter distances than men and invest more in each trip. And they invest a lot in what they call care mobility, which is a difficult concept, and they try to operationalize it, but it's especially among poor households. And Valentina, her colleagues, have shown a similar story. So women tend to use much more transport, particularly lower income ones. It's more fragmented. They spend more time on longer distances than higher income groups. And interestingly, her work is a lot about domestic workers, who are important in Latin American cities. They are important in Bogotá and in Colombia in general, and many other Latin American cities. And they tend to have the longest commutes. Valentina, forgive me for such a bad summary of your work. Now, my work with urban health or public health people has taught me a number of things, and I can't pretend to be the expert on this. But there's interesting work by Cervero and Olga Sarmiento and others about trying to look at what are the features between ill health and mortality and accidents and urban form. And it's very clear that if you've got low residential densities, so peripheral suburban areas, where you need a motorized vehicle to move, then your health is going to suffer, because you're not going to walk. But also, if there's a pedestrian, there's a kid crossing the road, you're going to kill them, right? Or you're going to have an accident. Lack of pedestrian connectivity between streets is also bad for your health because it means people will use the car instead of walking. The low levels of mixed land use, again, this modernist dream of separating users is very bad for your health, and the poor levels of localized social facilities. So again, interesting work coming out in health. I didn't see many topics in health in this, maybe because it's not part of the symposium, but it's something that we need to think about. And essentially what happens is, through modernist planning, through all these factors that I've talked about, we, for generations, have been given top priority to motorized transport. And that's a big mistake that we need to really work too hard to correct. And this is what the public health people are showing us, and that interaction is important, and I would encourage you to sort of reach out to your public health people. So public transport is associated with more active forms of travel. The Transmilenio, BRT in Bogotá proved that. Again, work by Olga and Sarmiento and Cervero about 10, 15 years ago, etc. Now, thank you to Daniel who provided me with these fabulous pictures. So essentially, higher active travel, which is essentially when you use your body to move around, as opposed to use fossil fuels or other mechanical means, is higher among the poor in Latin America than among the rich. And that is very clear. And this shows here in terms of percentage of all trips that are done by walking. So this is the 6 strata, socioeconomic strata, in which the population is not strictly speaking, but I'm not going to get into that discussion, but this is a proxy for socioeconomic stratum. 1 to 6 is not, anyway, so the poorer walk longer, or more percentage of trips are done by the poor, walking, same in Sao Paulo, same in Santiago, Chile, and the same with cycling, with a difference to, maybe Daniel can explain, maybe it has to do with cost of cycles, or the experts in cycling here. Again, the same story. Now, my argument in all this is that very few people are free to choose where they will live, where they live, right? It's a market that decides. And we have a major crisis in Europe now, and certainly in the UK, for rentals. So young people can't afford the rent in London. So they have to go out into the cheaper areas. And that means that if you can't afford to live, and you're in a peripheral area because you were born in an urban settlement that was informal, because of all these historical factors, then you're anchored to that place. And being anchored in a place which has no opportunities, whether it's jobs or education or health services, you get stuck, right? And this is what is the reality of many, many millions of people around the world. And increasingly, as cities become more these enormous sprawl areas without adequate transport, that is a reality that we're facing, and it's a reality that we ethically, as transport planners, as urban planners, as public health people, we can't really face. We really have to work towards that. So my argument is, in the absence of affordable and dignified transport, dignified is an important one, dignity in transport is important, physical marginality turns into socioeconomic marginality. And transport is very central in this story. So how do we foster affordable low-carbon transport that offers opportunities and a dignified life to all? And I'm going to show you some examples which are, it's only the ones that I know, I'm very ignorant about a lot of these things, but a lot of these, as I said, will be filled in by gaps. Luis, how am I doing for time? Where's Luis? You okay? Yeah? I have about 10 minutes to go. I don't want to bore people. Yeah, okay. There's plenty of coffee for people to wake up later. Now, as I said, Medellin is a city that I became really fascinated. I was born in Bogotá and came to Medellin when I was a teenager, and then as a professional for something, and I was sort of, wow, what's this city all about? And it was a time when Medellin was going through very interesting, urban-centered, but especially huge interventions by what is effectively a very rich, powerfully endowed municipality. This is Medellin only, not Medellin has the metropolitan area comprises 10 municipalities. This is the largest and the richest of them all, Medellin. So when you talk about Medellin, be careful to distinguish between the metropolitan area and the municipality. And a lot of people make that mistake. Now, what Medellin did was, it has some of the highest levels of socioeconomic inequality in the highest in the country, probably. But that's debatable, but among the highest in Latin America. So it's bad. A lot of concentration of very rich people in some areas, a lot of marginality in peripheral areas, as I said. So they did, okay, let's use the instruments of transport planning, of urban planning, and socioeconomic investments, or social programs, to try and redress these imbalances. Otherwise, they'll have blood in their hands, essentially. I mean, the differences were so bad. And what they did was to actually work towards a true multimodality in transport, which was adequate to the area. So you have, for example, the cable cars that we talked about, that Juan Pablo mentioned, and this is a different cable car to the ones we worked in. This is a much newer one. So cable cars are a way of reaching populations which are informal, dense, where there is no way of opening up a new road, either because it's steep or because you have to knock down quite a lot of houses, and then you're able to fly over them and reach areas. And as I said, Línea K in Medellín, which is the one that we studied with Juan Pablo and colleagues, and Hernando, who's also here, and Daniel, in fact, we realized it's a fabulous form of transport because it's adequate for the topography, the density, and the socioeconomic realities. And it changed people's lives, which was the work we did now nearly 15 years ago. So that's the one, and that opened the doors, the gates for cable cars everywhere in Colombia, many places of Latin America, and even elsewhere in the world. Then they had the only metro system which is overground entirely in Colombia, and they built it in 1994, 96. Juan Pablo, who remembers there? And it's a T shape, right? And it's all overground. Then they did the BRT, which you know about, and essentially it was a debate between the transport planners and the metro company, which is state-owned entirely by the city and by the province around it, because the metro company wanted it to be a feeder system to the metro to increase the ridership, etc. But they also built a metro system in an area which is very dense, historical, and again connects to this cable car and another one. And in areas where they couldn't build, I mean, it's all the topography again, where they couldn't build cable cars, anything. They built things like these mechanical, escalators, which are heavily looked after by people. But these are very poor areas. And of course, they added, when this was the metropolitan area, they added free cycling. So Medellín has approached and embraced multimodality to respond to socioeconomic density, topographic area realities, which I think is an interesting example to look at. We're all familiar with these. Now, these, I think, no longer exist because they've been banned, these mobile systems. But otherwise, there have been lots of revolution, and there are lots of experts who know much more about me than these, including Darío, who's here. But it's about, carving out space to non-motorized forms of transport, pedestrians and so on. This started out, one of the earliest ones that I found is by Maurice Lapidus, who I think was Ukrainian. Hernando will probably tell me. Was one of the earliest pedestrianizations projects in 1959 in Miami, Lincoln Road. And I witnessed the start of that when I was starting going to Medellin in 2006, which was pedestrianizing areas, which of course has a lot of opposition from traders, etc. Now, the other one, which I think the Dean mentioned, was the Ciclovía Recreativa, which is a measure which I think is temporary. I'm not a great fan of Ciclovía Recreativa because it doesn't shift model forms from using cars to using cycles on a regular basis. Apparently, this is what people will correct me if I'm wrong. But it closes off streets to traffic, to motorized traffic, entire areas, big stretches, to cyclists, to people on roller skates, to walkers, etc., except motorized transport. It's completely banned. Bogotá has one of the oldest ones, and it's, I think, probably the largest. Again, Luis will correct me. Launched in 1974, I think it's the longest, no, definitely it's the longest, as this graphic says. This again is worked by Olga Sarmiento and colleagues. It's closed on Sunday, so if you were here in Bogotá and managed to walk around Bogotá, you would have seen the ciclovia, how they closed off. This generates jobs. There's businesses that revolve around it. It's a safe space for families to go around with their kids and so on. It's a lovely thing. I think it's remedial. I don't think it's led to major changes. People postpone the demand for example, open and green spaces because they've got, oh no, you've got the ciclovia. Why do you want open spaces? Why do you want green spaces? It takes as an argument the fact that, yes, you work from 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, and therefore on Sunday you rest, and therefore that is a very old-fashioned way of saying. So I have my criticism of the ciclovia as a permanent feature. This is not to deny its wonderful virtues, but we can get into a debate with people like Juan Pablo who really know the stuff. Now, the other intervention, which I think is a very costly one, again, is my hat working with public health people, is green spaces. And green spaces, with climate change, with the fact that we're now more aware of health issues, people are less and less active, obesity is a problem that is growing. Their biodiversity is we need to go back to biodiversity in cities, a degree, a modicum of biodiversity. Then how do we create green spaces in cities? And this is a topic that I've been studying with a colleague, Camilo Santamaria. We wrote a paper, which is not published yet, because I need to do a little bit of archival work, but it's comparing two parks, newly formed from built environment, one in London and one here. This is a zonal park. Mine is a neighborhood park, the one I studied. But Camilo did a fabulous work because he was the designer of this park. Essentially, it's not far from here. You can visit it. It was a very run-down area. I'm not going to go into details, but it's gruesome. Lots of drugs, prostitution. It was, socially one of the worst areas, with a little bit of heritage buildings, beautiful buildings. But the mayor at the time was Peñalosa, again, known for his BRT initiative. And this is what it looked like at the time. It was sort of very densely built. Made the decision, I think controversial, but that's why we need politicians, let's face it, to sort of knock down that and unilaterally create this park. Now, this is a very far cry from this, right? And this park is now used, in the first incarnation, it was much more a contemplative park, more like a Hyde Park than a leisure park, than a sort of sports park. This is a second intervention. This is not Camilo Santamaria's first design. It's a second one where Peñalosa, in his last second administration, which finished a few years ago, decided, well, actually, what people want is leisure and they want is exercise. So no more about the contemplative thing, the biodiversity. Let's give them, because they can't afford gyms and so on, let's give them sports facilities. Anyway, this is a brave intervention, but we need politicians to help us do these sort of things. But again, it's one way of reducing inequity. Again, we saw this counters of examples, and I'm about to finish. In particularly rich areas, rich countries, into the pandemic, sort of taking over parts of cities that are not were open to motorized transport, giving them out to pedestrians or to people eating out in the street. Now, I'm going to conclude here by making a few pleas or comments, which hopefully should get us thinking about these issues if you're not already, because I'm sure, there's fantastic work in the room. Now, I'm arguing that historical legacies, whether these are spatial or social or institutional, are very important. So we need to look at history. We can't afford to say, let's act on cities now as if, history didn't matter. History matters because institutions and even culture, in a way, is a legacy of history. And land use and transport have a huge inertia, which is very difficult to change, and this is a big challenge. This is more of an open rhetorical question. Are land use planners, because of the power of the market, subject to greater pressures from the market than transport planners? Now, there are silos opening up here, and even though we have in the title transport and land use, I would argue that these are separate professions with different imperatives and different trainings. How do we bring them together? And this is the wonderful thing about this this symposium. Are the middle classes allies or adversaries in the search for a more just city? There's very interesting work done in Latin America in the last 5 years or so about the, I'm going to say this word, it's a horrible word, judicialization of planning. Essentially what happens is with a set of new constitutions, which actually opened up what were very hierarchical top-down forms of governance and lawmaking to a much more horizontal, participatory thing. What happens is people can now demand, because they have the right, they can demand any public work. So eminent domain and the public, the collective, weigh a lot, but the individual rights also weigh a lot. And what these people who are largely geographers have been showing, including the case of Carrera Septium, which is a main thoroughfare very close to here, which I was shocked to say, I was telling our colleagues in Los Andes, I hadn't been to Bogotá for a year and a half, and I was shocked to see how deteriorated La Septima is. It's actually a main thoroughfare. So there's a stretch of about, 1 kilometer where you think, what happened here? So, was there a war? It's all full of graffiti, and that's because the successive attempts at intervene in it, whether to have a BRT, whether to pedestrianize it, whatever it is, have been blocked through the courts. So a plan, which cost a lot of money to put together through consultancies, have been blocked by courts, and usually by a judge that knows nothing about planning or about transport. And that's because individuals object to it. And this is interesting work that we need to look at. And I didn't see anybody in this symposium looking at that. And I think it is an important thing. What are the legal mechanisms to either allow or block, initiatives which have a collective interest? And a lot of it is about the middle classes. Middle classes tend to be, let's face it, or we tend to be selfish and think of our own interest. And go back to finalize to Dan Davis's idea of this dichotomy between the urban and the informal. A lot of it, the informal is stigmatized, and we need to start rethinking about that. I'm going to leave it at that because I realize it's been very long. Luis, is that okay? Great. Okay, there's a sort of a mini bibliography if this is going to be available, so thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Julio, for that interesting and very insightful presentation.
Do I sit down, or are we going to have questions and answers?
Yes, we have. This is unusual, but we are ahead of our agenda, right. So we have planned. Okay. I don't know if anyone have some comments, question to Julio. You are completely welcome.
Is there a microphone?
Yes, supposed.
Oye, hay un micrófono porque ahí. Sí, tal vez dos de una vez. Allá hay un señor.
Over there. Allá, mira. Please.
Gracias.
My name is Todor. I talk a lot. So
Like me.
Yes. I come from South Europe, where walking is kind of a common thing. In Sweden, walking and public transport is typically, in Stockholm at least, linked to rich people who dress up in nice suit and walk to the opera. And you mentioned walking and linked it to densities here, but I'm really curious. I mean, being here, you do the same thing like the North Americans. Basically, walking is not in the system. It's just a necessary evil. While in Europe, we try to bring the hipsters like me and, the rich people back to walking and kind of keep it as a lifestyle or kind of a mobility culture and so on. So I'm really curious about the core of walking and its perception in Latin America. And for example, if you see the streets here are not made for walking because you have so much CCTV. If you walk on the streets, you're in a dangerous position to be. So I mean, I typically show a tree in the middle of sidewalk of New York, which is like really high density. You have high density in Bogotá, but walking is off the book. So really about the morphogenesis or kind of the mobility culture of walking in Latin America as more like a story, anecdotal wisdom that you have. Like, would you, I mean,
Yeah.
they told us first, take Uber, don't walk here.
Yeah,
Okay?
that's right. That's
So,
right.
so it embeds really in the initial, if you come to Europe, first they tell you, you walk. You never take Uber or anything that is like linked with cars or anything. So very interesting to compare this.
But it also, yeah, that's a very good question, a very good point. I wouldn't claim, I have colleagues who work on walkability in cities, including Luis and Daniel here, but okay, my take on it, having lived in London for many decades, London is in many parts, it's not a great city to walk. It's very low density and distances are very long. And like Paris, so if you're as a tourist in Paris, you can walk anywhere. In London, it's harder, you know, because the sites are very, very far apart. So, you know, because London is one of the largest cities in Europe. I mean, Istanbul and Moscow are probably larger, so it depends on the size of the city. Stockholm, I've been to Stockholm, it's a wonderful place, but it's relatively compact. Now, Latin American cities are much bigger, much bigger. So if you think about Bogotá has a population of over 9 million, that already makes it very big. But you're right, I mean, the rich were always focused on the comfort, or middle classes, on the comfort, the speed, the travel, and walking. It was obviously in the 19th century and early part of the 20th century, there was no option. When the tram came to Bogotá in the early part of the 20th century, the rich started moving out of this central area to the north, which is where the vast majority of the, what I showed in the map by Luis, which is where the vast majority of people live who can afford it, because it's very, very expensive. There you can walk in shorter distances, and I think there's probably a slightly better culture of walking, but I wouldn't say enormous. People, the first thing they do is jump on their car. For me, as having lived in a city and in a neighborhood in London which is eminently walkable, I had a car for years. I gave it up about 8 years ago, and I couldn't be happy, because I always commuted to work anyway by bike. My wife is an artist, and her studio was within walking distance, so we didn't really need car. So I understand, and for me, I have the same anxiety that you have. You know, why can't we walk? The sidewalks, even in the rich part of Bogotá, are terrible. You know, they're not designed to for anybody who doesn't have full bodily abilities. And with mine, they're starting to fail. So I'm starting to look at holes and things and getting a bit panicky, you know, let alone on a wheelchair. So they're terrible. They're absolutely terrible. And I don't know whether anybody here from Latin America, Lake in Santiago, people from Buenos Aires or Mexico City, but the walkable districts tend to be Distrito Roma in Mexico City. They tend to be walkable, but they're relatively small spaces with tree lined and so on. Second factor is security. You mentioned that. There's a huge paranoia, particularly in places like Bogotá and Sao Paulo, and places where you're going to get mugged. And so people who can afford it jump on a car or an Uber because they feel safer that way. And that actually is a terrible downward spiral, because that means that, you know, people are not watching to each other. Incidents of mobile phone thefts are huge here, including with physical violence. They are in London, by the way, as well. They're terrible. London, you know, everywhere in London, you hear these horrible stories about people, you know, getting mugged and electric bikes getting stolen and all that stuff. But then there's the reality of the poor who live in peripheries, and they have to walk to where the public transport is. But also they walk, and the same goes for sub-Saharan African cities, and I think Indian cities. They walk because it doesn't cost them money. So for them, for the poor, they're ready to invest more on time than on scarce financial resources, which are very difficult to get hold of. So walking, and Daniel has a paper later on today about walkability in Freetown and Maputo, for example. You know, walking is a reality for the vast majority of the urban poor everywhere in the global south, because it costs them money, because there's no public transport, but not the rich. The rich will always go on a motorized vehicle. Okay, there's more. I don't know whether we probably need a microphone. Yeah, great. There's a lady here. Two more? Okay, sorry. You see, we talk a lot. sorry.
Hi, Julio. My name is Andrea Sangil over here.
Yeah, hola.
I'm from the Global Network for Popular Transportation. I think you mentioned informality a lot, mostly linked to housing, but I'd like to just kind of like make the note that informality in transport is huge in Latin America and also the Global South, and I think we need to highlight it in these spaces because of the essential role it has, especially for lower income population. So I just wondered if you could comment a bit more about that, because I know UCL has done a lot of work on that, and there's several people around the room that are working on that, and I think it's usually invisible in transport.
No, I agree, and I must apologize, Andrea, because I had a space to include that, and at the last minute, Luis says, you have to send your presentation now. And in the end, I couldn't find something that, so, you know, it's a very poor excuse, but of course, they had that, yes. Informality, it's all Luis's fault. Informality is in housing, yes, but also labor market, and there are two different concepts, for those of you who are not familiar with Notion. And for us, there's the transport informality, and we've got fabulous work being done, including by our joint, Daniel and I, student, Maria Jose Nieto, who's working on that. She sent me some graphs, but they're so complicated. I said, no, I can't really summarize this. So I must apologize to Maria Jose, because I didn't include her graphs in the end. But effectively, yes, the poor, and I did some work with a PhD student of mine in Bangladesh, in Dhaka, which has been actually downloaded quite a lot, because what it shows is the rickshaws in Dhaka, which employ 1 million people, 1 million people. Right? A lot of them are migrant workers who come for seasonal work. And interestingly, they're not used by the very poor in Dhaka, in Bangladesh. They're used by lower middle classes, and particularly women, because it gives them flexibility, it gives them safety. You're nodding, so you probably know Dhaka, and maybe you can tell us more about it. So yes, informality in transport is a reality. In a way, my last conclusion was about that. Let's not stigmatize informality. It is a reality. Let's do something with it which is constructive. But this dichotomy is not helping. It's not helping because, you know, that generates jobs. But also, the minute the informal sector, I worked a lot on water years ago in sanitation, but water providers in many cities that we studied, and we did a study of 5 cities, water providers become a cartel, and they can charge any price they like because they're not regulated. And the institutions turn a blind eye to them, and the poor get squeezed. And we have data showing how the poor pay 20 times more per liter of water than the rich, because they're subject to these. So again, it's an issue that we cannot turn a blind eye. So thank you, Andrea. You're right.
Buenos dias. Hello, I'm Arturo Ardila Gomez. I'm an alum of this university, proud alum. Julio, on your second point, you mentioned the market here, pressure, but you don't mention land use regulations. I'm in the transport practice at the World Bank. We have the colleagues in the urban practice. As of July 1st, we will be in the same vice presidency, by the way. Hopefully, urban and transport practitioners at the World Bank can work together. But the urban colleagues have produced research that shows that land use regulations such as floor area ratio, minimum plot coverage, a front yard requirement, a backyard requirement, etc., have priced out. And according to this research by the urban colleagues, it's one of the main reasons for informality. Hernando de Soto, in his book in the 1980s, told us that urban planners were told by politicians, price out the migrants from the hills. Don't let them come to Lima. They move nonetheless, and they build favelas, slums. Sorry, that term shouldn't be used. Informal areas, barrios, however you want to term them. What is the role of land use regulations? And by the way, tomorrow at 11:30, my colleague, he and I will be presenting on the role of land use regulations impacting urban transport use. Thank you.
Thank you, Arturo. I think at long last we're going to meet, because I've read your work and we've known each other for a long time, but distantly. You're right. I'm not a great fan of Hernando de Soto, by the way, but you're right. I mean, even there was a regulation, you being from Colombia as well, we now remember that there was one of the earliest regulations in Colombia was the normas mínimas, which was in 1971, Hernando? Yeah. And what that decided was, the minimum plot of land and the minimum regulations that had to be put in place. So, there's a long history of doing that. And he was very clear from the start. And I saw it, I did some work in Zimbabwe decades ago, and realized how exactly what you're saying, that these regulations, if they're not consonant with the socioeconomic realities of people, are actually excluding people. So the work that your colleagues are doing at bank is great, but it's not new. It's been done for a long time, and I think it is important. But it's debatable in many ways of how we go forward, and in the end, it's an important issue. So thank you for pointing that out. There's another, this lady's been insistent. One more question, and that's it. Yeah. I'm running out of.
Thank you. I'm Deepthi from Transportation Research and Injury Prevention Center, Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi. It was an eye-opener to understand the context of Latin America. As compared to this, Indian cities, which are still very dense and a lot of people belong to lower income group of strata. However, comparatively in Indian cities, what we are finding is there is a lot of mix of neighborhoods. So we cannot very clearly define that this is high income settlement, this is a low income settlement. Right. The advantages are there. Because few of my recent work is actually showing that the access of low income settlements is better than the higher income settlements, whether it's to school or jobs. That means they can access these facilities within walkable distance. However, in terms of who makes the choice of walking, exactly right, saving the time and saving the money. So the pedestrians are majorly coming from the lower income strata. Yeah. So the context over there is very different, and it therefore forces us to understand the need and understand the motivations behind different income group of strata to decide what kind of mode that they are going to choose. And whether they will move faster to personal vehicles if they are going to, let's say, if they can afford it for the same travel distances. So that there remains a concern for Indian cities.
Yeah. Okay, great. That's a fantastic addendum. Dario has his hands up. Last one, Luis, will you allow Dario? Just quick one.
Muchas gracias, Julio, por volver a su alma mater. Thank you so much for coming back to your alma mater. One thing that probably was missing in the narrative, and it's important, is the great growth in the 60s and early 70s. You go back to colonial times, and probably that part is important in the narrative. And also, you mentioned the fact that we talk a lot about sustainable mobility, but we keep building roads. So probably it's important that we keep ourselves very bipolar.
Okay, thank you, Dario. I think that's it, no? Okay, thank you all very much. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much to everyone. Morning. Just this morning, the next presentation, the next block of presentation are in this building, in the 6th floor. Just for now, this is the 2nd floor. Yes, we have 3 sessions: accessibility with the chair of Rafael Pereira. The second one is active travel with Dia Loop, and a post-COVID session about with Joao. And right now, please. Right now in the desk registration, you must to register to the field trip that you want to go. Please note that we have limit of capacity for the field trips, okay? And for logistics, safety, and other considerations. Another issue is not everyone send us your presentation. We completely understand. So please be there in the corresponding room 10 minutes early to upload the presentations. And another issue, the Lincoln Land Use Policy Workshop that is going to be next Wednesday changed the room. Please check in the website the changes. And that's it, please. We have just outside to the auditorium, coffee, snacks, water, and we'll see. We have half an hour break. Thank you.
Thank you.